As we work with strings throughout this unit, you're going to see a few different ways that strings can be created. So we're going to take a minute here to look at the 3 different possibilities for creating, declaring, and initializing strings so that you're comfortable when you see them coming up in later lessons. So the most common way that you've already seen is to create a string variable, give it a name, and then set it equal to what we call a string literal in quotation marks. This sort of does all the steps in one and saves this string into our variable called alpha. The second method is you can declare a string variable but leave it null. And this is going to be like creating a space, like we talked about, where you can then, later on, go ahead and assign it a value. You've seen this in earlier lessons. This third way of creating a string is new, and so we wanted to make sure that we spent at least a moment introducing you to this, although in lesson 4 you're going to get a more in-depth explanation of why we construct a string this way. But just so you become aware of it, the way you construct a string here is you declare the string data type, give it a variable name, and then set it equal to a new string, and then in parentheses here we're passing in the literal, the value that we want our string to have. This is actually similar to how you've seen a scanner created in earlier lessons. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind because there's a connection between scanners and strings that we're going to emphasize as we start to talk about objects and classes in general. But for now, when you see this happening, just know that that's another way to create a string data type. Congratulations! You made it to the end of lesson 1. In this first lesson, you learned about how strings are a class data type, which is different from a primitive data type. And there are some differences that are important to remember when you're working with class data types versus primitive data types. One example was that class data types are stored as a memory address instead of just an actual value. But there are some benefits that come with class data types as well. One of those benefits is that you get to use methods, you get to store a lot more information, right? Strings are really important. It's important that we are able to store entire sentences. This means that you can actually write programs that store an entire book, right? Being able to store an entire book means that we now have an interface which allows humans to store our written language in a computer so that a computer now understands human language. Kind of. Doesn't totally understand, but at least it can remember words. The other thing you learned is that when we have to create a placeholder for an object, we use a keyword null. Null is an important keyword because it represents an object or a class data type that has been declared. We want to remember that it's going to be created later, but it hasn't been created yet. Those were the key concepts for this lesson. Congratulations for making it to the end of lesson 1.